Hey everyone, the last couple of lectures examined Rococo and neoclassical art and some of the socio-historical moments that have helped to contextualize that, specifically within France. I wanted to take a look at a continuation of those themes in that topic as we take a look at the Enlightenment and Romanticism. So as we take a look at this, we're going to examine some of the major intellectual and social and cultural trends that are happening in the 18th century. The first one I want to take a look at is the Enlightenment. Now, this is going to correspond to neoclassicism. Now, neoclassicism is an art movement, like that label that art historians have given to a very specific period of art, a very specific style of art. Enlightenment is much more broader in terms of what it's focusing on. It's focusing on the philosophy, ideas that are emerging in the mid to late part of the 18th century, right? So this is a historical, social, intellectual, and it does have some cultural elements to it, a movement that focuses on the importance of human reason, right? So what the Enlightenment is celebrating is, what enlightenment means is that we have the ability to think, right? Enlightened means that you're able to see the world more clearly, right? And so it uses scientific methods to encourage political and social reform. And so we see the development of sciences that are happening. It really begins during the Renaissance with a rebirth of understanding ourselves and the world around us. And it continues on in Holland, where we see more development of schools and that happening with their booming economy, and this continues into this trend continues into the 18th century with universities starting to focus and celebrate human reason, our ability to think for ourselves, our ability to solve problems, our ability to use rationality rather than focusing on mysticism or focusing on magic. What they're focusing on is what can be proven, right? And so that is a different kind of element. And as they start to use these scientific principles of doubting everything, questioning everything, these are the ideas that we discussed during the Baroque era, that we need to have doubt, we need to have uncertainty. The idea of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. We need to question everything except what cannot be doubted, right? And so it's examining these ideas, continuing on into the 18th century. They start to then apply them to political and social reform. And so these ideas greatly influence the American and French revolutions. I like this particular quote by Charles Dickens, and it comes from the opening lines of A Tale of Two Cities, which is really about the French Revolution and also its connection to what's happening in England. And this is what he says: "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, and it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair." And in a lot of ways, that sums up the Enlightenment. It has all of this wisdom, all of this excitement, all of this light and hope and change. But yet it also brings a lot of complexity. It brings a lot of death. It brings a lot of destruction. There's a lot of reason, and then there's also a lot of foolishness. And we're going to take a look at that when we examine the French Revolution, which we're going to apply the political principles of the Enlightenment to then, a revolution of change, of a new government. But it's also going to lead to, it's going to be a messy process. It's not going to be very clean. And so about this time of the French Revolution, he says, yes, it was the best of times. People had more of a voice. They had more opportunities, but it was also the worst of times. There were beheadings in the streets, and there was a lot of corruption, right? It was an age of wisdom. Yes, a lot of more thought and intellect, but yet we were doing things. We weren't really applying that wisdom very well. So it was also the epoch of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. We believe in humanity, but it was also the epoch of incredulity, right? This idea that there's this kind of sense of loss, a season of light, a season of darkness. And so it really does capture the essence of this time. So as we think about the best of times and the worst of times, really this is centered in Paris. And we've taken a look at France and the major developments during the Baroque era, the ideas of grandeur and excess and opulence. And this is all centered around Versailles, right? The development of this palace just outside of Paris in order to make it the most elaborate palace in the world, right? And so what we're going to see, though, is that there's going to be tensions with the King of France using one half of France's GDP just for his own personal purposes, to glorify himself as the Sun King. This legacy is going to start to be called into question, with people rising up to gaining more wealth and notoriety within the middle class. We're going to see people wanting more political voice and more restrictions on the government to stop them from doing just whatever they want to, right? A couple of major ideas that are happening during the time, right? So these individuals, Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, Voltaire, and Kant, are all associated with the Enlightenment and Enlightenment philosophy, right? Where what we see with Fragonard and the swing is it's more about being frivolous and playful and just doing, living a life of luxury. People start suggesting, maybe our political leaders, the one that have a voice, need to pay attention to people and not just themselves, right? So images like this, right, Fragonard's The Swing, help to illustrate to people some of the problems of why the aristocracy need to give some of the power back to the people, right? John Locke argues for the separation of church and state, and among other things, right? So one of the major ideas that he devises or asserts is there needs to be a separation of church and state. And this comes after about 100 plus years of constant conflict between religious powers and secular powers, right? So we've seen the 80 Years' War between the Dutch-speaking world and the King of Spain, constantly battling it out for supremacy and having mainly centered around, political but also religious tensions between the two. Similar ideas, similar tensions are happening in England between the Anglicans and the Puritans. Similar conflicts are happening in France. And so what Locke suggests is if we really want the most amount of happiness, we need to make sure that the church does what the church does and the state does what the state does. And there's this kind of separation. We shouldn't have the state imposing a specific national religion or telling people what to think or what to believe. And this becomes foundational for the United States when the founding fathers are, organizing or thinking about, developing their own government. These are the major ideas that are going to influence them, right? Montesquieu argues for a separation of government powers, meaning, and this is a direct attack on the idea of absolutism that Louis XIV enjoyed, right? All powers invested in a single ruler. He suggests that leads to corruption and tyranny. And so we need to have the government separating powers. And so there needs to be certain groups within the government that can do certain things but can't do other things, right? And then other branches within the government can have different types of responsibilities and roles. And so this is going to heavily influence the ideas of the founding fathers in terms of having an executive branch, a legislative branch, and a judicial branch, right? Each of them are going to have oversight, but each of them have their own specific roles and duties, right? Rousseau argues that the government should promote democracy, equality, and liberty to support the common good. If you want to make the most amount of people happy, you need to pay attention to what the people are saying, right? You need to be able to, you can't just ignore them, 90% of the population and just focus on your own sneaky deeds and fun things, right? You need to pay attention, and particularly if you're a good leader, right? An ideal leader. Voltaire argues that governmental overreach lessens human happiness, right? The idea is that the government that governs least governs the best, right? So the idea that too much government power restricts our ability to find happiness. And so you have to think about this, though, in the terms of when they're making this argument is coming out of absolutism, when the government has all control, all power, and so he's making that argument that the government definitely needs less power and influence. And Immanuel Kant argues that government has a responsibility to and not taught, but to educate its citizens and create a better society. And so the idea is that the more educated people are, the better the society is going to be, the more able they are to think and act for themselves. And so the idea of educating people shouldn't be seen as a scary thing, as we see with David's The Death of Socrates, where he's educating people and then they put him to death. It should actually be seen as something that's empowering and giving people an ability to start acting and thinking for themselves. These ideas influence the American Revolution, right? The ideas of not trusting the past and questioning, right, tradition. The idea that we need to do something different, that we can't just keep doing the same thing. If we keep doing the same thing over, we're going to get the same result, right? And the idea of seeking a form of government that focuses on rationalism, reason, right, rather than just merely tradition or the divine right of kings, right? The idea of equality, right? The idea that that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? This is a slap in the face to the previous idea that there were some that were just born better than others. They had better blood coursing through their veins. And the colonialists are suggesting, no, everyone is born equal. Everyone is born the same, which was a radical idea, right? The idea of the right, and I can only imagine what King George III would have thought when he read that in the Declaration of Independence, that these people, these Americans, they're not even really English. They're living in this new world, and we see them as lesser. They're declaring that they're equal to me, the king who has a noble birthright and noble blood. He's like, don't think so. He must have laughed, right, when he saw that. And he must have saw that as a direct defiance, kind of this treasonous declaration, right, in addition to actually declaring independence as an act of treason. Actually declaring equality, right, would have been that as well, right? The idea of rights, right, the laws of nature and the laws of God entitle us to equal treatment, as it says in the Declaration of Independence, right? The idea that everyone should have equal rights, not just, some people should have, greater opportunities because they're wealthy or because they are noble. The idea is that the law should treat everyone the same, right? And the idea of independence, right? The idea of being able to have the freedom to sever ties from the current government, to be able to form your own government, right? That is a radical idea. That this was the first time in modern history that an entity rebelled against its governing power and won, right? Every other time there's been rebellions and attempts at revolution in the past, but they've all been put down very violently. And generally what would happen is they would put all of the revolutionaries' heads on a pike, and then they would put it at the center of town for everyone to see as they walk by, right? The idea is that get in line, the government tells you what to think, what to believe, what to do, and don't question it, right? So this idea of revolution was pretty radical. And if the colonialists were if they were unsuccessful, they would have been all executed for revolting, right? But the fact of the matter is, they were successful, and that granted them that independence, and then they're able to apply the ideas of the Enlightenment to form their own government, centered on this idea, this radical idea that they're bringing back from ancient Greece of democracy, right? As we see the influence of Pompeii and Herculaneum bringing renewed interest in these, Greek and Roman ideas. We see philosophers start going back and studying, right, these ancient ideas, and they start saying, okay, what made them great civilizations? What was it about Rome that made Rome great? What was it about Greece that made Greece great? One of the things that they found, or they carried over, was this idea of democracy, that people can have the ability to have a voice in the government, right? The idea of e pluribus unum, right? That out of one or out of many comes one to share their voice, right? But then there's also this idea of limitations, that the government should have limitations, that it can't do whatever it wants, right? There are certain things that it can do and certain things that it can't do. It just can't go and imprison people without due process or due cause. There needs to be, the government has these strict limitations, right? This is all kind of, another revolution happening at the same time that's helping to kind of create this climate is the Industrial Revolution, right? With the increase of global markets, the increase of machine power, right? We see that the demand of the global markets and the ability to now produce more with the machines gave this booster shot to the middle class. We saw that happening in Holland, and now that's going to start happening in France. It's going to start happening in England, and it's going to start happening in the United States, right? So this idea of industry, right? The idea of gaining more wealth and ability, right? Couple of just thoughts to think about, right? So one is the textile factory in England, just that the image there of the importance of these manufacturing goods. And then James Watts developed the steam engine in 1769, which allowed for boats to travel faster. This is then going to then translate into the steam locomotive in 1803, which is making travel a lot easier, a lot more accessible, which is allowing people to be able to travel greater distances and ship goods over further areas and be able to then gain more money, right? Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which would take, I think it would take a day to do like a pound of cotton, but you could do like several pounds in an hour with the cotton gin. And so it's able in making textiles and production much more efficient. And this is going to then create the idea of expanding markets and being able to make more goods and services is going to allow this rising merchant class to be able to have more wealth. And then once they get this, they're going to start saying, we need more political abilities as well. And we've examined this particular work before, right? And this helps to, returning to this work helps to frame that, the discussion of the work, and then what we've been taking a look at today in terms of the rising merchant class and their desire to be able to enter into the political sphere and have a greater political voice. And we see this happening with the American Revolution, and we're going to see it happening with the French Revolution, right? So I just wanted to briefly give you some historical context to know how artists are perceiving the world, how this shapes their world, and how it's going to influence art, right? The three major players of the first major wave of the French Revolution is Louis the 16th. I think he's like the great-grandson of Louis the 14th. Marie Antoinette, his wife, and then Maximilien Robespierre, who is a revolutionary, part of the Enlightenment and Enlightenment ideas, right? Inspired by those ideas that we've been taking a look at with Montesquieu and Locke and Kant. Inspired by those ideas and then wanting to apply them to government, wanting political change, wanting political reform, right? When Louis the 16th gained power, he was only 17 years old, right? He marries Marie Antoinette, and she was only 15 at the time. And then he took the throne in 1774. And then when he came to power, he was challenged by two major groups: the aristocracy, the people that were kind of lulled into complacency by Louis the 14th, right? Just focusing on leisure and games. They're now wanting more power and more access. They want to end absolutism. And then he's also confronted with the rising merchant class, which want a greater voice. And so these two groups are pushing for reform, and Louis the 16th isn't having it, right? Another major problem is in his bride, right? Marie Antoinette comes from Austria. She's an outsider. She comes into France, and she's never really welcomed. So part of the problem for this is that, she comes from Austria, which wasn't necessarily radical for kings and queens to marry outside their country. But coming in at the time that she came in, when there's all of these kind of social upheavals that are happening, it made it even more of a tense time, right? Now, the third and another major problem that Louis the 16th faced was the economic woes of France, right? As he comes into power at the time when, just at the cusp of the American Revolution, he had been rivals, or France has been rivals with England for the last, several centuries, and saw England as their political enemy or potential enemy. And so what he believed the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so what he does during the American Revolution is he starts to fund the Americans, giving us money and resources and ships and whatnot, helping us with the Navy, in order to help the colonialists win over England, and thinking that if we win over England, then England will somehow be weaker, right? And he was right. The problem, though, is that took a great amount of financial strain on France. And all that's just to say that France, by the time the French Revolution rolls around, they were pretty much bankrupt, and so they were having a super hard time financially, right? Which only proves to the aristocrats and the merchant class that there needs to be change. This is further proof that the king has bankrupted us, and so we need to be able to reform this so that we can correct the ship, so to speak. Another major problem that factors into this is Marie Antoinette, right? Marie Antoinette comes to France, and the only job of a queen is to produce a male heir to continue on the divine line of the king, right? The royal family. However, Louis the 16th had a particular problem that made it difficult for them to be able to conceive children. And so she did not conceive for the first 5 years of their marriage. And to the people of France, that proved to them that she was an utter failure. Why she gets the total blame for this, I'm not entirely sure. Probably because they saw her as an outsider anyway, and just might as well blame her. We're already angry with the king for other things. Let's just throw her under the bus. But as a result of the problem that Louis had, she kind of finds other kind of outlets, right? One outlet is going to parties. Another outlet is dressing in fancy clothes and buying and shopping, which during the Rococo era would have been totally fine and normal. During this time where France is bankrupt and there are these revolutionary ideas out there, it becomes much more of a precarious situation for her to be in. And so she's seen as extravagant. She's seen as having all of these problematic liaisons, and she's seen as wasting France's resources, right? So where Louis the 14th was, using the resources to build Versailles for his own glory, times have changed. Fast forward about, 50, 100 years later, times have changed, because now that kind of wastefulness is seen as problematic. And so they nickname her Madame Deficit, right? She's not the one that bankrupted France. She's not the one that funded the Americans in their fight over England. She didn't do any of that, but she takes the brunt of it as the queen, right? So this is the two become one, right? The Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette, both of them here are reduced to animals to demonstrate their foolishness and inability to govern. A couple other images just to represent Marie Antoinette and her lavishness, right? The one on the far left is very indicative of Rococo art. We would see that and we're like, oh, that's Rococo art, very elaborate dress. She has the fleur-de-lis on, which is the emblem of France. And so here she is trying to represent herself as, no longer Austrian. I'm all in on France. I'm the French, part of the French royalty now. But the people, as they're perceiving this art, they're perceiving it, they're interpreting it now differently, right? So as times change, the tastes of people, what they expect out of art, changes as well, and that's then going to change art itself, right? The two other ones are just cartoon images that demonstrate her going off at parties and all of the rumors that start emerging, or her elaborate dress where a suitor kind of grabs her and then she escapes underneath it. But it's all demonstrating how problematic she is, because she's not producing a male heir, and it just is further indication that the entire French crown is corrupt, right? So what happens as a result of this, right? There is a call for what is known as the Estates General. And this is kind of like Congress meeting in Washington to talk about the future, right? Talk about plans and legislation and all of that. The problem was that this hadn't been convened in 175 years. It's not like it's convening all the time or once a year or anything. This doesn't, I mean, Louis the 14th pretty much shut this all down and just said, I'm just going to lead. And so I don't need other voices in here. But now there's a greater cause or greater call for having more voices, right? So you have the three estates, and you guys have probably heard this before. The first estate is the nobles, the nobility. The second estate is the clergy. So these are coming from the like cardinals and from the Catholic Church. And the third estate is everyone else, right? So about 97% of the population was in this third estate. So only about 3% of the population were nobles, but they made up 1/3 of the voice, right? And so 97% of the population has 1/3 of the power, right? So there's an inherent imbalance within the system, even though at first glance you think 1, 2, 3, everyone has 1/3 of the voice or 1/3 of the power, right? But if you actually look at it in terms of raw numbers, it's a very imbalanced system. Anyway, right? The Estates General starts calling for reform, right? The nobles and the people start calling for change. They're starting to ally, and Louis XVI doesn't like that. He doesn't like the way that the direction that the assembly is going, and so he just ends the assembly, and then he goes and he locks the doors. And he says, if I lock the doors, they can't come inside the building, and they can't make any decisions, and so therefore I have won, right? So this is a way of shutting them down. The problem was it didn't shut them down. What they decide to do when they show up for the Estate Assembly the next day and see that the government building is locked, they go to a nearby tennis court, which is just right across the street, and they meet there, and then they form what is become known as the tennis court oath. And this suggests that they will not stop pushing for reform until he hears us, right? And so this idea that there's these revolutionary ideas that aren't going to go away, right? And this is a representation of what's happening, right, within art, right? This idea of calling for change, aligning yourself to a political ideal, right? Now, when Louis XVI saw this work, and he hired David to do a lot of painting for him, and so he becomes the royal painter for the King of France. Now, when he saw this work, he thought, yes, this is a great work because it is demonstrating how people should ally with me. I'm the king. They should pledge their oath to me of loyalty and whatnot. And they should be willing to die for me, for I am the state. Or that's at least what Louis XIV thought, right? The problem is that the people, when they saw this, they have a different reading of this particular message, right? They're inspired by this, but in different ways. They're not inspired to ally themselves with the king. They're inspired to ally themselves with the nation of France. They decide to ally themselves with the principles of what they're fighting for. And so it's a different reading, right? And so David, even though he is he's a court painter, heavily entrenched within the French aristocracy, he actually becomes one of the leading voices for the French Revolution, ironically, right? Not necessarily that he was trying to do that, but he does, because his works are so powerful and so inspirational, right? So it's something to kind of consider. And we see similar ideas with the death of Socrates, being willing to die for one's principles and move forward, right? So what happens is when Louis kind of shuts down everything, he's like, I'm not going to agree to this, and he keeps pushing people away. On July 14th, 1789, people storm Bastille, right? And Bastille was a medieval prison. Well, it was still being used as a prison, but it was built in the Middle Ages. And it was mainly where the king sent the worst of the worst people. So if you were really a political prisoner, you would be sent to Bastille. The reason why people stormed Bastille was, number one, it had arms there, so they're looking for the weapons there. And the other reason is that this was the symbol of the king's power, of his ability to use psychological power. If you defy me, I'm going to send you to Bastille, the worst of the worst prisons. And so they storm Bastille, they tear it down brick for brick, right? And so this is the beginning of the French Revolution. Now, what's interesting about this is they look at Louis the 16th's journals, and what he does on this day, July 14th, 1789, is he goes hunting for the day, which is very indicative of what you would think that people of the Rococo era and the aristocracy would do, right? People just go off and they're about leisure, right? Ironically, as he's going off in leisure, we have Paris, right? He's doing this in Versailles. Paris is under assault. As he's going to bed, he writes in his journal, nothing, meaning I didn't see anything, I didn't shoot anything, nothing came back from the hunt, right? And it's interesting that he writes that down on this day, which is forever going to change French history, right? And it shows you the disconnect between, his life and what's actually happening around him. His guards come in at night before he lays down to bed and says, Sir, the people have taken Bastille. They're storming the streets of Paris. Paris is under siege. And he said, is this a revolt? And his guards say, no, sir, this is a revolution, right? So this idea that this isn't going to go away, right? You need to pay attention. You need to have change, right? Now, this kind of dies down temporarily, right? This kind of the storming of Bastille, and he's able to make some concessions. He gives them some things that they want. That kind of dies down for a second. But then what happens is the second wave of the revolution picks up. And what happens during the second revolution is that France, due to their failing economy, is plagued by massive inflation to the point where bread is inflates to the cost of a month's worth of wages, right? So it's extremely expensive. Now, we think about that in the context of the United States, and we don't really, bread is like whatever. We don't really think about bread as important as they would in France or other places in the world. But if we think about it, what we do value in the United States, right? Think about a pizza costing 1 month's worth of wages, right? And if that ever happened, and it kind of seems like with inflation happening right now, maybe it could. I think you would see riots in the street, right? Cars would be turned over. There would be, fires everywhere on the streets. And so there'd be a massive revolution. So there's this massive inflation that's happening in France at the time due to their failing economy. And what happens is a group of women, go to Versailles to try to get the king and queen to listen to them, right? They're suggesting you gotta pay attention, right? So they go here, right? We talk about this, the kind of the gilded gate that to enter into Versailles. And they start, saying, you need to hear us, you need to hear, trying to get their attention. And it's at this time that Marie Antoinette utters the famous line that she probably never said, let them eat cake, right? So while the people are starving, she says, let them eat cake. And it sounds nice, right? A nice little bundt cake or a nice little devil's chocolate or something like that. But cake was the stuff at the bottom of a pan, right? All of the baked on, gross burnt stuff. And so when they heard that, and she probably never said it because she probably wasn't that aware to be able to say it, they jumped over the gate and they stormed the palace. And they were all looking for the king and queen, right? Now, when they hear that they're coming, the king and queen hide themselves away. But as the rioters are running through the halls of Versailles, and it's a big place. It's going to take them a long time to try to find the king and queen. They are shouting all of these kind of, hard things to hear, that they're going to tear apart Marie Antoinette limb from limb. They're going to cut out her tongue. They're going to cut off her ear, right? These very violent things, because they see her as this symbol of the failures of France. And so they find their way to her bedroom, and they slash the mattress to pieces, which seems a bit odd. But if you think about it in the larger context of where the new era is going to come, where the new line of royal family is going to come, right? They're suggesting royalty ends now, right? So this is kind of a claim for that. They eventually find the king and queen inside the palace, but at this time, they're able to calm them down slightly. But they do kill some of the king's guards in their attempt to get to them. And what they do is they march Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette back to Paris with the heads of their guards on a pike, right? And then they put them here in the Conciergerie in Paris. And this used to be an old castle for the old kind of, royal families in the old days. But at this point, it's functioning for them as a prison, right? So it's not really a kind of a prison, but not really. And so this is where they're going to spend the rest of their life, right? And what happens is while they're in there, Marie Antoinette writes to her father, who's the King of Austria, "Dear Daddy, they have me locked up and I don't have any freedom. Please come get me. Sincerely, Marie Antoinette." I don't know if that's exactly what it said, but something along those lines. And he told her, "I can't come and get you, but if you can get to me, I'll protect you." And so Marie Antoinette talks with Louis XVI and says, "Look, if we can get out of Paris, if we can get to Austria, we can be free from all of these revolutionaries and all the craziness that's happening." And so what Louis XVI does, he bribes a guard, and the two of them go off in the middle of the night with a disguise, right? They have this kind of this cloak on to disguise their clothing. And they race off towards the border between France and Austria. And they get 1 mile from the border. And a border guard sees them and stops them and says, "Monsieur, mademoiselle, do you have your papers?" Right? And they don't, of course. They don't have a passport to be able to get through. And so they're kind of stuck. And so then the question is, well, what do we do? Do we, make a break for it and try to run? And then they capture us and potentially kill us. I don't want to head back to Paris. That's going to be seen as problematic. And so what they then do is the king throws off his cloak and reveals that he is the king, thinking that the guard is going to recognize that he's in charge and bow down and say, "Okay, sorry, king, I didn't mean to get in your way." And instead of this, he sees the king fleeing during a time of conflict. And so he says, "Nope, not going to happen." So he drags them all the way back to Paris. They're stripped from their noble title, and they are now put on trial for treason. And the king, more specifically, put on trial for treason and then executed. And this is just a newspaper representation of the execution of King Louis XVI. This is going to be the first of many executions at the guillotine. And the guillotine was seen as this new device during the Enlightenment, which was supposed to be scientific. It was a humane way of executing someone rather than putting him in a firing squad or hanging them. This was seen to be much more efficient because the knife just comes down, cuts the head off, and then the person is killed. Now, it doesn't necessarily take into account that sometimes the blade was dull. Sometimes it didn't go all the way through. It was pretty gruesome. Didn't always work the way that they thought it was going to work, but it was seen as this kind of this civil or civilized way of executing someone as part of the Enlightenment. What happens as a result of the King Louis the 16th's death is that Maximilien Robespierre, who is calling for this, calling for change, essentially takes over as the de facto leader of Paris, and he's going to start implementing these radical ideas of the Enlightenment, calling for democracy, calling for change. But then what happens is you start seeing that this instability is problematic, and so the first thing that he needs to start doing is taking away people having their liberties. He needs to start taking away people's voice. He needs to start taking away their ability to complain. And so he starts clamping down as a tyrant on all of the problems of France. And so this is what's become known as the Reign of Terror. He starts using the guillotine as a way to terrorize people into compliance into this new form of government. So you could be standing in the bread line waiting for bread, and you complain about the bread prices and inflation, and all of a sudden someone can turn you in for complaining against the state, and you could be executed for that, right? So he starts, clamping down on people's ability to have the freedom of thought and freedom of expression and a voice within the government. All the things that he once stood for, he abandons, trying to maintain control. So it's kind of ironic that he does that. He also is calling for more and more death of the nobility. He wants all of the nobles killed. He wants to baptize. These are kind of his words. He wants to baptize the streets of Paris with blood, with their blood, right, with the noble blood, in order to bring forth in this kind of quasi-religious kind of analogy, bring forth the rebirth of a new state. And so he starts calling for more and more people to get killed. 20,000 people were killed in Paris, right? And 2,400 were killed in 1 month alone, right? So it's a very gruesome, right? The best of times, the worst of times. Yes, this is the worst of times. There's a lot of hope in these new changes, but there's a lot of problems that go about it. Taking a look at Jacques-Louis David, right? So he was initially a court painter, but he sees the tide change, and so he gets quickly on board with the revolutionaries, and he does this for Marat. Marat was a revolutionary, a writer of the Enlightenment, much like what we see with Robespierre. Robespierre is much more of an orator, much more of a politician, so to speak, where Marat was more of a newspaperman, a journalist that would print his words to inspire people. And Marat keeps calling for more and more people to die. We need more death. We need more clarity. We need more purity, right? We need to make sure that the people that are in France truly are behind these revolutionary ideas of the Enlightenment. We can't have anyone that is associated with the past, that wants the king to return to power. We don't want any of the royal family, right? So he keeps calling for more and more death. And then finally, a woman sneaks into his apartment, and he's known for taking long medicinal baths. He comes from the lower classes, and there was a period of time, according to legend, that he lived in the sewers. He was so poor, and he contracted a skin condition that made it very painful. And the only way that he can get relief from this was taking long medicinal baths. And so he mainly wrote in the bathtub. Charlotte Corday comes in while he is writing, taking a bath one day, and she stabs him. Where David depicts it as, I don't know if that's necessarily a mortally located wound. Not really my field of expertise. It doesn't necessarily look like it's really in the jugular. Doesn't really look like it's in the heart. But whatever. We'll just give him the benefit of the doubt. But you can see clearly he's representing Marat as some type of quasi-saint, which is kind of an interesting way to represent him. Kind of this referring to Michelangelo's Pieta, right? The idea of the peace in death, or Saint Cecilia by Maderno. this idea that that one can die for principles and they will, then live on. Their ideas will live on. Now, the difficulty, though, is Pietà and Saint Cecilia are religious messages, but what we have with David, this is a political person willing to die, but it's being coded as a religious message, which is very very different, very very problematic. Now, just to continue the story with Maximilien Robespierre, just briefly. Maximilien Robespierre started making greater changes within France. He changed the working day from the working week from 7 days to 10 days. And the reason he did this is to try to get rid of religion. He said he didn't want people knowing when Sunday was. He wanted to completely remove tradition, and he believed that the Catholic Church had too much influence, and if people were clinging to these past ideas, they won't recognize or fully realize the future of what's ahead of them in terms of the Enlightenment. So he wants to separate that. And what he then also does, he changes the holidays. And then he takes down the saints of the streets and he replaces them with different names. And so if there's a street named like Saint Sebastian Boulevard, right, he would change that. He wanted to completely remove religion. And then one day he was having a political rally, and they were in this big kind of auditorium or kind of arena. And then he emerges kind of at the center stage, walking down a ladder dressed in a white toga, which is super weird and super creepy. And then people started thinking, you know what, who does this guy think he is? Does he think he's God? Does he think he's a God, right? He kind of had his own religion. His religion was science, and now he's kind of imposing this idea onto us. And so it made people start to question, right? And people start to question his allegiance. They start to question his alliance. And this puts him in jeopardy, right? He calls for, I'll put a pin in that. I'll come back to it in just a second. He starts calling for Marie Antoinette to die as well, because he sees her as a threat because her father is from Austria. And he believes that because her father's from Austria, the Austrians might invade to try to get their daughter back. And so what he does is he launches a preemptive campaign against Austria, and so going to war with Austria in the event of trying to protect them from war, which is kind of weird. But then what he does, he starts to see her as a traitor. She's locked away in the conciergerie for, the rest of her life. And then she's able to write letters to her father, but then he starts saying, well, she's writing coded letters that's giving away our military positions. And she's communicating with the enemy, right? She wouldn't have any knowledge of any type of military position while she's in prison. She doesn't have she's locked away, right? She doesn't have any access to that. So she has no idea what's going on. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was Austrian. She was a symbol of the hatred. And so he says, let's execute her as well. And so they put her on trial for this. They even argue that she has an incestuous relationship with her children, which wasn't true, but truth doesn't really matter during times of fear, during times of anxiety, during times of hysteria. Truth doesn't matter. It gets thrown out the window. And so they put her on trial. Here is Jacques-Louis David drawing her as she goes by. They put her in this cart that has bars around it. And then they march her through the streets for people to see their queen and spit upon her and shout all sorts of obscenities. Her hair is cut to reveal her neck, so the blade, for the blade at the guillotine. And then she is executed in front of the people. And so this is where the executions take place. And they've erected this monument here today, so you can go to Paris. This is right downtown Paris. You can see where it actually happened. But just to continue on with the story of Maximilien Robespierre, as people started feeling, kind of gross about the direction of where he was going, they put him on trial for being corrupt and problematic. And so as he's in prison awaiting trial, he is able to secure a pistol, shoots himself underneath his chin to try to kill himself, right? Very similar to what we see with Socrates. You're not going to take my life, I'll take my life instead. But what happens is the bullet doesn't go all the way through, but it breaks his jaw. And so during his trial, they just lay him out on the table, and he has his head wrapped to stop the bleeding. and his jaw's broken. And so this great orator, the kind of the irony here, the great orator that used his words, used his ideas to take a hold of the ideas and values of France, is rendered completely speechless at his trial. He's condemned to death, and he is executed to the guillotine, which is interesting that kind of the beginning of the Reign of Terror was the execution of Louis XVI. The end of the Reign of Terror is the death of Maximilien Robespierre. And so they become kind of these interesting bookends. The person that was calling for change, calling for the death of the king, this movement that he created, this hysteria that he caused, right? This fire that he ignited eventually consumed him, right? I just want to show you this real quickly. This comes from Studio C, but it represents Maximilien Robespierre and the time. Captures the essence of some of the ideas that we've been taking a look at and brings them together. The ideas of Rococo and the aristocracy just wanting to party and not really knowing how to live or to work, kind of capturing that humorously. But also capturing the ideas of the Enlightenment and wanting reform and wanting change, right? And that kind of tension coming to a head, right? So we'll leave off here. The next lecture is going to take a look at the next wave of the revolution with Napoleon Bonaparte and our introduction into Romanticism.